things actually all wear out. Okay, we will be covering chapters 35, 36, and 37 of Genesis. Any particular questions you want addressed before we start? Nobody has any questions? Okay. You want to talk about Deborah?
No, just why is she thrown in there?
So you don't want to talk about Deborah?
Well, I'm asking you, why is she thrown in?
You know, that's a really good question. Why is Deborah thrown in there? So let's just go ahead and look at chapter 35 in Genesis. And it says in verse 8, now Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried below Bethel under the oak. It was named Allon Bakuth. I don't know how old she was, but I imagine she was fairly old. She was Rebekah's nurse. We don't know when Rebekah died. She died sometime. It's just not really recorded. Jacob makes reference of it at the end of his life when he's talking to Pharaoh. And so he talked about Rebekah dying, but we don't have a notice in Genesis itself saying she died like we do with Sarah and Rachel. What we do have is Rebekah's nurse dying. So she had to be a fairly old lady. She'd have been a lady that was older than Rebekah, that the father sent with Rebekah to make sure Rebekah's needs were taken care of, that would have raised Rebekah. So that put her, a good 20 years older than Rebekah. And eventually she dies here. I do find it interesting, when you look at the verses just before this, you see in verse 1 of chapter 35, it says, then God said to Jacob, arise, go up to Bethel, and live there, and make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, put away the foreign gods which are among you, and purify yourselves and change your garments. And let us arise and go to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God, who answers me in the day of my distress, and has been with me wherever I have gone. So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods which they had, and the rings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak which was near Shechem. As they journeyed, there was a great terror upon the cities which are around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. So Jacob came to Luz, that is to Bethel, which is a land of Canaan, he and all people who were with him. He built an altar there and called the place Eth Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. And then, of course, we have Deborah's death note there. You want to remember that in the previous chapter, Jacob finally got his act together. He had talked to God appropriately, and he put himself on the mercy of God, and God had taken care of him and said, go back home. For whatever reason, Jacob, when he went back home, stopped at Shechem. He should have gone back to Bethel because that's where he saw God in the first place, so that's where you'd think he would go. But for whatever reason, he stopped in Shechem, spent some time there, and then we had Dinah's rape, and then we had the murder of everybody in the city, and then we have all the sons getting a bunch of wives, concubines, things like that. So nothing good happened there. God says, you need to get over to Bethel. So he goes, and he tells everybody, you need to get rid of your gods. So no doubt, we're talking about Rachel's teraphim that she took from her father. But we're also talking about the gods they would have got from the city of Shechem when they took all the wives and the children and the property and all the gold, took all that stuff. So Jacob knows about it. He says, you need to get rid of it. So they all buried under an oak. Coincidentally, Deborah's buried under an oak, right? Right, so she's buried under an oak. So Moses wants you to see a connection. First of all, buried under an oak, all these things that are not appropriate. Deborah buried under an oak. So then they go along, and Jacob realizes that nobody's attacking them because everybody's afraid of them because God is keeping them safe. When they get to Bethel, then it makes that note about Deborah dying. Deborah is the last connection they have to Padam Aram, to the old homeland. And once she dies, there are no connections left. And once she dies, well, then God appears. And so God has shown that we have a decided break with the old life, and now this is the promised land. This is where I've appeared to you. This is where I want you to make an altar. This is where I want you to worship me. So that's why I think he has the note about Deborah dying there. Make a note about putting away all the old things. Put away all the altars, all the false gods, everything to do with the old land, and now we have a new beginning here. If you look at chapter 35, you'll see that it goes between burial and journeying. We got a burial of foreign gods, then they journey. We got the burial of Deborah, and then they journey. We got the burial of Rachel, and then they journey. We got the burial of Isaac. That's how the whole chapter divides up between those things there. So the question I want to ask you, since nobody had any questions for me, is why is it that they buried Rachel in Bethlehem? I know we don't live in the promised land, and so sometimes it's difficult for us to remember distances, but Abraham's plot of land that he bought to bury everybody, we're just talking like 10, maybe 20 miles from here. And they could have buried her in the family mausoleum, so to speak. But they didn't do that. Now, they hold on to Joseph's bones for centuries and get him buried in a family mausoleum. Jacob is in Egypt, and they make a trip all the way back to the family mausoleum to bury him. But Rachel, the wife he loved, the one that caused so many problems, she gets buried right where she dies. Why is that? This is the part where you guys offer up answers.
Visited me, try to get it so I wouldn't have to have that constant reminder of what I lost.
So you don't think when he looked at Benjamin, he could see the constant reminder?
When I look at you, do I remember your mother?
You certainly do. I am her spitting image. Well, you know, I do have that beard, yes. Anybody else? Nobody? Nobody? Did anybody even consider that as being strange? Let's look at that. Let me just read that part here. Maybe the answer is in the text. So we'll drop down to verse 16. And then they journeyed from Bethel, and when they were still some distance to go to Ephraim, Rachel began to give birth, and she suffered severe labor. When she was in severe labor, the midwife said to her, "Do not fear, for now you have another son." It came about as her soul was departing, for she died, that she named him Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephraim, that is, Bethlehem. Jacob set up a pillar over her grave, and that is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. Then Israel journeyed on and pitched his tent toward the tower at Adar. So does that help? Anybody get an answer? You guys are in luck because next quarter, Chris will be teaching on Leviticus. One of the things that makes Leviticus so very challenging for us is it uses words like clean and unclean, holy and common, and we use those words, but we don't use them at all like Leviticus uses them. Because in our mind, if I say a person is unclean, we just mean they're dirty, go wash their hands. It's a strange way of referring to it, but we do that because it's a biblical word. We like to do that here. Holy, common, we talk about certain things being holy. Common are just everyday sort of things here. But in Leviticus, you have the idea of ritual. You have the idea of things that are set aside for God that are not sinful in and of themselves. They're just, this is the way God wants it. This is the way God doesn't want it. If you were a lady and you gave birth, you were unclean for at least 7 days. 30 days you gave birth to a girl baby. And that's because a birth involves blood, and blood is life and death. And so because of those things, and God is all life and not death, you are ritually unclean. Not meaning that you're sinful, not meaning that you've done something wrong. It just means that you can't approach God because he is a holy God, and you got to be a certain way before you come to him. After the birth, then you were still unclean for another 30 or 60 days, depending on which gender the baby was. For us, that makes no sense, but for Jews, it made perfect sense because some things are clean, some things are not clean, some things are holy, some things are common. You want to see that when Rachel died, she died giving birth. That made her ritually unclean. And ritually unclean was a condition that was spreadable. It was a contagion that other people could get, and if you got it, well, then you couldn't worship God appropriately. As Chris will point out, in Leviticus, you had two men who brought strange fire, who were unclean, who brought unclean things into God, and God struck them dead. Any questions? Okay. So when Rachel died in the act of giving birth, she was unclean, which is why Jacob just buried her right there. Well, no. So cleanliness and uncleanliness. So you want to remember you were holy and unclean. She didn't have a chance to become ritually clean. So she wouldn't be able to worship God. If she had survived, well, then the time would have passed and she'd be clean. Right. Yeah, but she died, so she had this contagion that was spreadable. And while the people could have themselves become contaminated, they could get clean. Carrying her body would just keep them in a state of uncleanliness the whole time. So it'd be hard for them to worship God the way they need to worship God. So that's why they buried her right there. What was that? You said it wasn't that far. You're right. But if I am touching you and I'm unclean, well then, it doesn't matter how far I got to carry you, I'll be unclean the whole time. I don't want to be unclean because I need to worship God because God is busy striking people dead left and right. He does things. The people are in terror because of how great God is, so we need to do things a certain way. So that's one reason why they did not take Rachel's body at all, because this whole uncleanliness, because she died in childbirth. That has nothing to do with her relationship with God. It has nothing to do with what we understand sinful godly. It just has to do with this is how you can approach God at this time and place. It's this understanding that helps us to appreciate how awesome it is that we worship today. We can come to God at any time. We can dress any way we want. We can talk to God in any place, anywhere, any condition, and we can go right to his throne. It's not that we have to go to this city, sacrifice this animal, let its blood drain, then have its meat burned, and then give it to the priest, and then we go talk to God. No, we can just talk to God whenever we want. And it's because of that that our relationship with God is so much greater and better and different than any Jewish person ever had. Cassie, were you going to have a question? Yes, ma'am. Well, you do want to make a distinction. We have a tendency to approach Leviticus and we try to give logical, scientific reasons as to why something is unclean and why it's considered clean. So we look at pork and we say, oh, it's unclean because if you don't cook it properly, you get diseases. Well, that's not the reason. The reason is solely because God said it's unclean. And we like to have order and sense. That's the way it goes. When God said a body is unclean, a dead body, then that's it. When he said if you give birth, you're unclean, but if you give birth to a girl, you're unclean for longer than a boy, well, there's no scientific reason for that. There's no medical reason for that. It's just God's drawn this distinction, and that's what he wants the Israelites to learn, is that they have a holy God, and they cannot treat him like they have treated their false gods. See, even here, you saw that when there was just Jacob and his sons, well, they had false gods. And Jacob knows about it. So he says, hey, you guys all need to bury these. Well, what kind of leader is he being when he has only a few dozen people, only 11 kids, 12 kids, and they got a bunch of false gods? He wasn't being a good leader. That's just the way it goes, because they were looking at things in parallel. I'll worship God. He is God. But I'll worship these other gods too because I think they're other gods. So we have those kind of issues going on, and those all tie into Rachel's, I don't want to say premature burial, but Rachel's need to be buried right then and there. Yes, ma'am? Yes. Chris? Okay. So what I want you to see is that it is unusual and it is significant that she's buried there. It had been easier from our point of view for her to be buried in the family mausoleum, but she wasn't because she was unclean here. And then we have Isaac being mentioned, and he's dead here. Let me read those last couple of verses. It says in verse 27 of chapter 35, Jacob came to father Isaac at Mamre of Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had sojourned. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years. Isaac breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people, an old man of ripe age, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. Now these are the records of the genealogies of Esau, that is Edom. I want to remind you that the Bible is not in chronological order, except when it has to be in chronological order. It's not put in chronological order, except in as much as something was written before something physically, and then something was written later in time. This is the perfect point right here. When you read this, you're like, oh, okay, they're coming into the promised land, and then Isaac dies, and then we have all the stuff about Esau, and then we get to Joseph. But when you look at the end of Genesis, it talks about how old Jacob is, how long he sojourned in Egypt, how old Joseph is. When you work out those dates, you see that Isaac was alive for 12 years after Joseph had been captured. Okay? So when we get to chapter 37, we see that Joseph is 17. So Isaac lived till Joseph was 29. But you wouldn't get that, read it like this. You just see, oh, he's dead. Because Moses has not organized this on a chronological point of view. He's organizing it to end this cycle of stories and move on to the next cycle of stories. and they're going to overlap and whatnot here. So you always want to pay attention to any chronological markers that are given because the author wants you to understand something, but you should not assume that it is even remotely in chronological order. The wonderful example, the best example, is the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is all over the place on how it's organized, and he gives specific dates at the start of all his oracles. And as you go through those dates, they're just from the beginning, middle, the end, all around, and they go all the way past into the exile and start of the exile, before the exile, no order at all, because that's not how he organizes his book in a chronological fashion here. The ladies are studying Judges. That's not a chronological book. You're going to see the end of Judges actually takes place at the start and not at the end. Okay, any particular questions on chapter 35? All righty. Chapter 36, we'll just cover in a second here. We have all these genealogies about Esau, and what Moses wants you to get ultimately is that even though Esau was not the elected child, he was not the chosen one, that did not mean that God wasn't willing to bless him. It just meant that Esau was not going to bring forth the Messiah. You do see that Esau was blessed because he was Abraham's son, and it was through Abraham that everybody's going to receive a blessing. And you can see that he has all these generations, all these kings, all this land, all these people, and he becomes a great nation, which is what God promised Hagar way back when. No, Hagar was Ishmael. Who was his mother? Oh, yeah, Rachel. No, Rebecca. Sorry. All these names really start to blur. They all blur. That's what God had promised Rebecca way back when and Isaac way back when here. So that's what we have chapter 37 for. Sorry, 36. Let me slow down. So let's get to chapter 37. Chapter 37 starts the final section of Genesis. It's a story about Joseph. And we have all these things talked about Joseph. So let's just read a few verses here. It says in chapter 37, verse 1, "Now Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned, the land of Canaan. These are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph was 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was a son of his old age, and he made him a varicolored tunic. His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. And then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, 'Please listen to this dream which I have had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up and also stood erect, and behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf.' Then his brother said to him, 'Are you actually going to reign over us? Are you even really going to rule over us?' So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now he had still another dream and related it to his brothers and said, 'Lo, I have had still another dream. Behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me.' He related it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, 'What is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground?' His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the sayings in mind." We'll stop there. What do you think about that when you hear that read? What do you think about Joseph? Say that again? Not the brightest bulb in the box, okay? His brothers did hate him, yes. Anything else? Think he was spoiled? Okay. Yes, sir? He could hear the voice of God. Okay. I want you to notice that most of the comments we have cast Joseph in a less than positive light. And that's typically how we view him as a young individual here. I want you to consider a couple things. Joseph is called a dreamer by his brothers in a mocking fashion because he has dreams. Of course, everybody has dreams, and so it's not that he related all his dreams to him. He just related those dreams to him that God had given to him. What is significant about these two dreams is that these are the only two dreams that Joseph does not give an interpretation for. Now, the brothers give an interpretation, and Jacob gives an interpretation, but Joseph just says, I had this dream. When you look at the rest of Genesis, all the dreams that come about, Joseph gives interpretation like this, just cranks them out. Here, he doesn't know the interpretation. He's presented to his family because God has spoken to him, which in this family should have made connections because God talked to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in dreams. So when his son has a dream, you would think there would be some sort of connection, but they don't. And the reason they don't goes back to Jacob being a dysfunctional father. So you want to see that it talks about Jacob loved Joseph. And because he loved Joseph, the brothers hated Joseph, which I always find fascinating. The brothers don't hate Jacob. They just hate Joseph. Not that Joseph made a determination to make his father love him, because he had nothing to do with that. But the brothers just wanted to hate whom they could hate. And you see, as you read that passage, it escalates up. You know, hate him even more, hate him even more. Now we're really jealous of him. And then we'll see in the next section, they're going to kill him. So it just goes straight through the roof. All because Jacob loved Joseph. You can see the love because he gave him that coat that was a long sleeve coat. That would have been a sign that Joseph was going to receive the blessing from Jacob, which of course makes sense because it was always the younger born son that got the blessing, not the firstborn. That didn't happen. It was always a younger born son. Well, if you look over at John chapter 4. John chapter 4, Samaritan woman. Let's see here. It says in John chapter 4, verse 1, therefore when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were, he left Judea and went away again into Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. And he came to the city of Samaria called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Jacob only owned one parcel of land in the promised land. And you see here that according to tradition, he gave that land to Joseph. So from a young age, Joseph knew he was going to be the leader, and more importantly, his brothers knew that he was going to be the leader, and they didn't like that at all. They just hated him, and hated him. So Joseph has some dreams, and he relays the dreams to them because he wants to know, because he can sense they're from God. I don't know how that works, but he just seems to know that. What do you think of the dreams? Oh, yes, sir.
We can't leave out that he squealed on his brothers, and that's not a good thing.
Oh, let's talk about that here. So that's a really good thing. It says in verse 2, Joseph, when 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought back bad report about them to their father. So you do want to see that the sons most likely were doing something that was wrong, and Joseph told their father. It is one viewpoint to say it's squealing. You know, we're going to rat him out.
He did it for their own good.
You know, but when you look at Joseph, you do get the idea that he comes across as a person possessing of wisdom. And regardless of the cost to him personally, he is doing what his father told him to do, and he was supposed to go monitor them. The Hebrew there is ambiguous as to who was shepherding whom. You could certainly take it that Joseph was just the serving boy to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. That's one way to take it. You could also take it that Joseph was the one that actually was shepherding the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. It's hard to tell what's going on here. So if he was the one to put in charge of them, this is why he's given back a report. But he's not the one that's generating the bad report. The son's actions are generating the bad report. He's just relaying what his father told him to do. So when you look at Joseph in this section here, a lot of our personal bents and personality come out in how we interpret Joseph. So I don't like my sons squealing on one another. I don't want them to be a tattletale. You know, when it's serious, okay, I want them to tell me that. But I don't need them running upstairs saying, so-and-so's listening to this radio when you said it's time to go to bed. I'm like, go to bed, okay? Don't bother me about that. That's not important. Just work it out amongst yourself here. But that's not what's going on here. His father gave him